It's now time, though, for the big story of the morning. And the U.S. government has threatened to cancel visas for individuals working with or supporting Cuban medical facilities, citing allegations of forced labor and claiming these missions enrich the Cuban regime. Caribbean leaders have pushed back against this threat, as Cuban medical missions are crucial to the region's healthcare systems. The U.S. has long been critical of Cuba's global medical program, imposing visa sanctions during Trump's administration and alleging that Cuba exploits its medical professionals. It's a hot-button issue being talked about a lot in the region, and we have with us from the region itself a man who is the head of Director of News, Sports, and Current Affairs over there in Antigua and Barbuda at ABS Broadcasting House. We have with us Garfield Burford to help us dissect this issue. My brother and friend, good morning, Garfield. How are you doing today?
Sir, good morning to you, Richard. Good morning to your listeners. Great to be with you again. Fantastic to talk about an issue that is, as you rightly said, is dominating the headlines right across the region. Good to be with your audience as well.
All right, Garfield. Now, would you say that what you're picking up, is the CARICOM community speaking with one voice, or just a few people saying some things, a few of the leaders saying some things? How do you view what's going on right now?
Right. It's a very good question. I think in general, there has been unanimity in terms of how CARICOM has responded to this issue. There have been very strong comments, very strong responses from some leaders. So some leaders are speaking more effusively on the issue. Some are more strident on the issue than others. But I think in general, there is consensus across the region, across the leadership of CARICOM, that look, this program has been highly beneficial to countries of the region. It has augmented the health systems and the public health care capabilities of the region. And without this program, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it would have been very, very difficult. So they're trying to push back against it, as you rightly said, and engaging the U.S. in discussions, but understanding that the U.S. can be, under certainly President Trump, can be quite mercurial in terms of its policies. And so the Caribbean region is looking to see how best to approach this issue, not angering the U.S. too much, not upsetting the U.S., but at the same time defending the program. Some leaders, though Richie, have indicated that, look, if it costs us our visas, for example, Mia Motley in Barbados says, if the cost of it, in terms of standing up on a principled approach for the Cuban Medical Brigade, if standing up for it means I lose my visa, well, so be it.
Yes, and I don't think that's the kind of talk that Trump likes to hear at all. Mia Motley is one of those, as you rightly mentioned. Ralph Gonsalves is another who has said similarly that he doesn't mind giving up his visa. Gaston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda has spoken out. Dickon Mitchell of Grenada, Roosevelt Skerritt of Dominica. They have all basically been pushing back. There are some Caribbean countries that we have not yet heard from officially. What do you think is going on behind the scenes now with these countries and the U.S.?
Right. I think that generally, because of the shifting geopolitical sands, Richard, I think that this is extraordinary. And I think, as I said, some leaders are more vociferous than others. And for example, the ones you mentioned are usually the ones to step forward and say very definitively what their position is. They're more frank than others. But I think in general, the others might allow some of the other leaders who are less talkative, more reticent on the issue, will say, perhaps, all right, let's try the diplomatic approach. Let's have a meeting. For example, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the U.S., is expected to meet with Caribbean leaders sometime later this month. It's not definitive when and where yet. But I think that meeting is going to be crucial to address some of these concerns, not just the Cuban medical brigades, but also several other issues, deportation, the immigration crackdown, the impact on the region, and the engagement with the U.S. The U.S., for example, have been saying, look, the region has to lessen its connections and engagements with China, for example. Well, will the U.S. step up and fill the breach if that situation happens? So several issues to be discussed, including, of course, the Cuban medical brigades. But I think you've had that very strong consensus, Richie, and leaders across the region have stepped forward to say, look, even if we do not benefit as much from the Cuban medical brigades as some of the other countries in the region, this has been very, very helpful. And so for the U.S. to say that, it is just not acceptable. But in terms of how they approach it, some are more forthright, some are more frank than others. Others perhaps trying to take a more nuanced approach and hoping that diplomatically it can be resolved.
I know that even Trinidad and Tobago spoke out, but I must ask the question: are you surprised that Jamaica has not come forward in definitive terms, or similarly, or with similar expressions to some of the other leaders as yet?
Right. I haven't heard anything publicly, certainly not reported publicly from Dr. Andrew Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, on it, but I've heard reporting in relation to Foreign Affairs Minister Senator Kamina Johnson-Smith commenting on the issue. She's stood up for the program, saying it's not forced labor, it's not exploitation. So that's a good sign, I suppose, from the perspective of working along with the consensus of CARICOM. I think that's a consensus position, that this is not exploitation. I think there's been a kind of pragmatic approach taken, for example, by Antigua's Prime Minister, who said, we're willing to tweak the way the nurses in the program are paid, the doctors, the nurses are paid. In other words, if the U.S. is concerned that some of the money is going to the Cuban government, we are willing to tweak so we might be able to respond to some of the concerns. But if it is that the U.S. is saying, we want you to cut all the times of the program, well, that seems to be an untenable position. But again, Jamaica's foreign minister has spoken about it. I haven't heard specifically any reporting on Dr. Holness speaking about it. Who knows whether or not he'll speak about it in the coming days, possibly before the meeting with Marco Rubio that's planned. Let's see what happens.
Indeed.
But again, the extent to which some leaders are more forthright than others, I think, that's generally the trend that we've seen on not just this issue, but several other hot button issues. Some leaders are more, definitive, strident. They'll go forward. They'll go for it first and talk about it. Others will be a little bit more reticent. Publicly, they'll probably engage in diplomatic efforts on for example, closed door sessions and so on. Let's see how that one pans out. But I think the general consensus position is the U.S.'s position is not tenable.
Yes. I can say that we made contact with someone involved with the public relations for the Jamaica Labour Party, and we were told that the Prime Minister will address this sometime, but we don't know how soon. I wanted to ask you, though, Garfield, whether or not you believe we'd have any advantage within the region if we were speaking with one voice, say a statement from CARICOM rather than several leaders, putting their view individually forward. Any benefits as a group? Yes?
No doubt about it, Richie. I think that is, look, CARICOM is 15 member states. It's a grouping of 15 member states, 14 of which are independent member states, the 15th being Montserrat, which is the British Overseas Territory. If the 14 independent states, for example, have a clear position on it, definitive, all the prime ministers essentially speaking with one voice, that has far more weight and heft than, for example, individual prime ministers giving their own views on it. Perhaps this issue did not arise during the most recent CARICOM meeting in Barbados, so it could not have been part of the communique. What was part of the communique from that CARICOM meeting was strong support for Cuba generally, and essentially a repetition of the call from CARICOM that the embargo should be lifted. But I think that once this issue has arisen, once Marco Rubio made that announcement about the possibility of imposing visa restrictions on foreign government officials who are believed to be responsible for or involved in the Cuban labor support program, then essentially then CARICOM needed to have seized the opportunity to issue a statement collectively, all heads having that same position. I think that would have had more weight and heft, and it would have perhaps drawn the attention of the U.S. even more quickly to the issue. But let's see. CARICOM has a tendency, Richie. I've covered CARICOM for several years. They have a tendency to perhaps dither a little bit, wait a little bit. Eventually, that statement might come. The consensus position among all CARICOM leaders might come, but it might take a little while. Let's see. Perhaps they are waiting until this meeting happens with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, expected to be by the end of this month. So perhaps that might be one of those issues that really tilts the needle in relation to having that CARICOM consensus position. Let's see what happens.
Yes. Do you believe that this matter has the potential to impact, maybe even negatively, the relationship between Caribbean nations and Cuba?
I think, if anything, Richie, it would strengthen that relationship. I think here's an opportunity for, and it's been seized by several of the CARICOM leaders, to express their very strong support for Cuba. And I think that Cuba has, welcomed the strong support that has been shown by several of the CARICOM leaders. I think, if anything, it is going to, I think it is an effort by the U.S. to say, look, let's see how strong your allegiances are. Let's see how strong your engagement with Cuba is, your connection with Cuba is. In other words, at the threat of losing your U.S. visa, will you stand up for Cuba? I think that's the test the U.S. is putting Caribbean leaders to and other officials to. And I think some have indicated very clearly that, look, if my visa is lost, so what? I mean, so be it. It's okay. For example, Mia Motley, as you mentioned, and other leaders. But ultimately, I don't think the leaders would want it to come to that. Mm-hmm. They would want a more reasoned and reasonable position for the U.S. to take. But as I said, I think, if anything, it is going to strengthen, for the most part, that relationship between Cuba and Caribbean countries, because these countries, out of pragmatism, if for nothing else, it might not be ideology, it might not be philosophy, just for pragmatism, just for pragmatic reasons. This program has helped significantly, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. Practically, Richie, there were some nurses and doctors during the COVID-19 pandemic across CARICOM who were fearful during the early months of COVID-19. Nobody knew what this thing was, and some of the doctors and nurses were fearful. It was some of the Cuban doctors and nurses who were on the avant-garde, who stepped forward and who played such a crucial and vital role in the COVID-19 response. So these countries understand what this brigade has meant in augmenting their healthcare systems. So if anything, it might not be, blind ideological support for Cuba, but it is a practical position of saying, look, we're being helped by this, we're going to defend it, and even if it means, some sort of pushback and some sort of vitriol from the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Do you know whether or not any alternatives to the Cuban medical missions, are currently being explored by any CARICOM nation?
Not what I'm aware of. I think, if anything, certainly in relation to Barbados, what has been happening on an ongoing basis. Barbados, for example, has looked to Kenya for nurses from Kenya, not necessarily as a replacement for the Cuban Medical Brigade, but to augment their own health systems. But I don't think there has been any sort of, certainly public indication from any of the CARICOM countries that they're looking as a way, certainly in the wake of what the U.S. has said, and certainly with the threats from the U.S., as a way of moving away from the Cuban Medical Brigade. I think generally they're saying, look, we're going to lean on the U.S. We're going to say to them, look, we're defending this program. It is not exploitation. It is not some sort of human trafficking or forced labor or coercive labor practices, as the U.S. has indicated. So I think that generally is the position at its point. I don't think, certainly not publicly, they have not said that they're looking to diversify away from the program, to abandon the program in exchange for something else because of what the U.S. has been saying. Yes. But as I said, there's a broader question of how do we in the CARICOM region try to build capacity within the healthcare system in general. So in other words, this issue of nurses being poached by North American countries and European countries has been a big issue for many years. So several of the countries of CARICOM are suffering from the same issue of losing nurses who go to other countries because of higher pay and better conditions. So I think that issue has to be dealt with in a more holistic way. But no, certainly not in the wake of the U.S.'s threat.
Yes.
I haven't heard of any country saying that we're going to move away from the Cuban program in exchange for something else.
All right. I know it's a busy morning for you, but if you allow me just one more question, I wanted to just look finally, at the potential consequences for Caribbean nations. I mean, obviously, there's the possibility that their leaders could lose their visas, maybe some diplomats and so on. But outside of that, are there any implications in terms of trade, for instance, any repercussions on that side?
Not what the U.S. has said so far, but knowing, as I said, the nature of the Trump administration, very transactional, they can also be very strong in terms of their pushback against countries which do not essentially follow their playbook. I think it is not inconceivable that the U.S. might want to step up the pressure on CARICOM countries. Now, bear in mind, Richie, the genesis of all of this, or pretty much a context for all of this, is that Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, is very, very openly, strongly opposed to the Cuban government at this point. The communist government in Cuba, of course, led initially by Fidel Castro, of course, his brother Raul, and now Miguel Diaz-Canel. So he's very, very strong in opposition to them. So I'm pretty sure that there will be that very strong position, that very strong pushback. It will test CARICOM's unity, their strength of their will, in terms of saying to the U.S., well, do what you may, but we're going to stand for the program. Now, it may be that the U.S. will want to step up the pressure and say, in addition to visas, okay, so if you're willing to lose your visas, well, let's see how, if your position changes, if we say, well, we're going to, make some other moves on trade or tourism. For example, most of the region is highly dependent on tourism.
Yes. And
the U.S. is the biggest source market. If the U.S. were to, for example, put some pressure or dangle some sort of threat, it might use the carrot and stick approach. It might give CARICOM leaders some inducements, or threaten them with even tougher action in relation to tourism or trade. I mean, that, of course, will also test their will and their convictions in relation to the Cuban Medical Brigade. So, I'm given what the Trump administration has done so far, how mercurial it can be. We will see whether or not it will arrive at a consensus position, or it will up the ante and say, look, if it's not visas, if that's not going to sway you, we're going to do something else. Let's see whether or not you're strong enough to deal with that issue as well.
Yes.
It's going to be highly, highly interesting to see what happened, certainly in that meeting with Marco Rubio and CARICOM, which is planned. Again, we don't know the time and the date, but it's planned for some time later this month.
All right. We value your thoughts. We value your analysis, and that is why you were the person we thought we'd call this morning. And I thank you so much, Garfield Burford, for spending time with us and breaking it down as you did. Thank you so much, and you have a great day. Looking forward to our next conversation sometime.